Welcome to Xi Jinping Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Chinese foreign friendship chief goes on tour to boost U.S. ties. Chinese officials in flurry of visits to military command to support war plans. China at risk from rapid housing downturn as stock market hits new 5-year low. China's investors take shots at state media spin as stocks fall. China and the U.S. are talking, but their détente has limits. Chinese foreign friendship chief goes on tour to boost U.S. ties. South China Morning Post. China is using non-official channels to strengthen diplomatic ties with the U.S. by sending the head of a body dedicated to promoting friendly overseas exchanges on a tour of America. Yang Wanming, president of the semi-official Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, is traveling across the U.S. for 12 days, visiting Washington, Texas, Nevada, California, and Washington state. The trip aims to deepen the friendship between the two nations and advance cooperation between sister cities. It comes after Joe Biden and Xi Jinping agreed to encourage business, cultural and educational exchanges between the U.S. and China. Chinese officials in flurry of visits to military command to support war plans. South China Morning Post. Several provincial-level officials from mainland China have visited the People's Liberation Army's Eastern Theater Command, which oversees Taiwan, in recent weeks. The visits come at a sensitive time, following Taiwan's presidential and legislative elections in January. The officials pledged their support for the command's war readiness and expressed hope for reunification with Taiwan. The visits are seen as part of Beijing's messaging to Taiwan following the election of President William Lai Ching-te of the independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party. The U.S. opposes any attempt to take Taiwan by force and is committed to arming the island. China at risk from rapid housing downturn as stock market hits new 5-year low. Telegraph. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has warned that China's economy is highly vulnerable to shocks following a rapid downturn in its housing market. The IMF predicts that housing investment in China will drop by between 30% and 60% compared to 2022 levels, resulting in a significant decline in economic growth. The country's exposure to property market shocks, coupled with weak productivity and an aging population, puts the economy at risk. China's stock markets have already suffered as a result of these economic challenges. The IMF has called for further support measures to address the situation. China's investors take shots at state media spin as stocks fall. Bloomberg. Chinese state media outlet People's Daily ran an article claiming that China is filled with optimism, in an attempt to counter growing concerns over the economy and stock market. However, as stock markets tumbled shortly after the article was published, Chinese internet users responded with sarcasm, sharing the headline of the article along with their own negative experiences and financial losses. The article and subsequent market drop highlight the growing sense of disillusionment among Chinese investors. China and the U.S. are talking, but their détente has limits. New York Times. China and the U.S. have restarted negotiations on curbing the flow of fentanyl to the U.S., following discussions in Bangkok between China's top diplomat and President Biden's national security advisor. The talks are one of the few outcomes of the November summit near San Francisco that President Biden can claim as a win. China is the main source of the chemicals used to make fentanyl, which kills 100,000 Americans each year. However, the negotiations also highlight the divergence in rhetoric between the two countries, with the Biden administration viewing China as a strategic competitor and Chinese officials rejecting this framing. China's economy looks more unstable than ever. The Sydney Morning Herald. Chinese equities are currently a contrarian buy, as the Shanghai and Shenzhen share markets are close to reaching their bottom, according to Ambrose Evans-Pritchard in The Telegraph. China's President Xi Jinping has shown concern about capital flight and loss of confidence, leading to an increase in easing measures. The country has ramped up fiscal, monetary, and regulatory stimulus, which should be enough to prevent a deflationary spiral for now, said Wei Yao and Michelle Lam from Société Générale. The authorities have added 1 trillion yuan, $140 billion, of fiscal stimulus for social housing and water projects, with another trillion earmarked for March. The People's Bank of China is adding quasi-fiscal money through special loans and has announced a further trillion yuan will be added to liquidity by cutting the reserve ratio for banks. Last week, China's State Council pledged to stabilize the market and it is preparing a 2 trillion yuan fund to prop up the stock market directly. The bank's blunders will send Britain into deflation. Telegraph. Inflation in the UK is likely to fall below 2% in the first half of 2024, 18 months earlier than the Bank of England's forecast, according to Capital Economics. The Monetary Policy Committee has been criticized for keeping interest rates high for too long and continuing with quantitative tightening despite a fall in the M4 money aggregates and a squeeze in credit. Economists on the shadow MPC have called for an immediate rate cut to avoid recession and debt deflation by 2025, as well as a halt to quantitative tightening until liquidity has recovered. The Bank of England has expressed concern over wage growth, but Capital Economics argues that inflation will rebound and rise above 2% in the third quarter, which is highly questionable. The falling price of Chinese goods is also having a deflationary effect on the global economy, with Chinese export prices falling 12% in dollar terms over the last year, and 18% in euros. Japan sends feelers to Trump, don't strike China deal that could rattle region. South China Morning Post. Japan has been trying to engage with people close to U.S. presidential hopeful Donald Trump, as it fears that a potential deal between Trump and China could jeopardize years of collective efforts to rein in Beijing. The Japanese government is concerned that if Trump is re-elected in November, he may seek a trade or security deal with China that could undermine recent efforts by the Group of Seven, G7, wealthy nations to counter China. Tokyo also worries that Trump may impose protectionist trade measures, such as tariffs on steel, and revive demands for Japan to pay more towards the cost of stationing U.S. forces in the country. The Japanese government has sent a senior ruling party official to try to meet Trump and has also engaged with think tanks and former U.S. officials aligned with Trump. Japan's outreach is part of its efforts to understand whether these issues would likely resurface and to convey Tokyo's positions. Hey there, folks! It's your friendly neighborhood 6 doctor here, bringing you the latest news from the 6 degrees world. Let's dive in. First up, we have China making moves to strengthen diplomatic ties with the U.S. The head of the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries is on a 12-day tour of America, aiming to deepen the friendship between the two nations. It's all about promoting business, cultural, and educational exchanges. Friendship is always a good thing, right? But wait, there's more. Chinese officials have been making visits to the People's Liberation Army's Eastern Theater Command, which oversees Taiwan. This comes after Taiwan's recent elections, and Beijing is sending a clear message of support for its war plans. The U.S., on the other hand, is committed to arming Taiwan and opposes any forceful takeover. It's like a game of chess, but with much higher stakes. In other news, the International Monetary Fund has warned that China's economy is at risk due to a rapid downturn in its housing market. The IMF predicts a significant decline in economic growth as housing investment drops. With weak productivity and an aging population, China's economy is feeling the pressure. Oh, and let's not forget the stock market hitting a new 5-year low. It's like a roller coaster ride, but without the fun. Speaking of the stock market, Chinese investors are not buying the state media's spin on the situation. When People's Daily ran an article claiming that China is filled with optimism, internet users responded with sarcasm and stories of financial losses. It seems like the people aren't buying it, quite literally. Hey, at least they have a sense of humor about it. Moving on, China and the US are talking about curbing the flow of fentanyl to the US. China is the main source of the chemicals used to make fentanyl, which is responsible for the deaths of thousands of Americans each year. It's a serious issue, but it also highlights the divergence in rhetoric between the two countries. The Biden administration sees China as a strategic competitor, while Chinese officials reject this framing. Can they find common ground? Time will tell. Now, let's talk about China's economy. Some experts believe that Chinese equities are a contrarian buy, as they are close to reaching their bottom. President Xi Jinping is concerned about capital flight and loss of confidence, so the country is implementing various stimulus measures. But will it be enough to prevent a deflationary spiral? Only time will tell. It's like a high-stakes game of Jenga, but with money. And finally, Japan is reaching out to people close to U.S. presidential hopeful Donald Trump. They're concerned that a potential deal between Trump and China could undermine their collective efforts to counter Beijing. Japan fears that Trump may impose protectionist trade measures and demand more payment for U.S. forces stationed in Japan. They're trying to understand his positions and convey their own. It's like trying to navigate a minefield blindfolded. Well, folks, that's all the news I have for you today. It's been a wild ride, but remember, even in the face of uncertainty, we can always find a reason to laugh. So, what are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you have any burning questions? Let's hear it. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.